This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
We don't want to admit that we're human, if you will. And so I think modeling that conflict resolution and apology, like, I'm sorry I said that, I didn't mean it, or I'm sorry I yelled at you, I shouldn't yell at you, can really be helpful. But looking back, it's okay to kind of laugh at ourselves too and realize that what were we thinking?
Yeah, we have to laugh at ourselves. Welcome to the Parent Footprint Podcast with Dr. Dan. I'm Dr. Dan, your host, and let me tell you about our mission at Parent Footprint. That mission is to make the world a more loving and compassionate place, one parent and one child at a time. We believe the key to raising happy, healthy, and engaged kids is for us parents to seek the same in our own lives: happiness, health, and engagement. We believe that awareness is the foundation of your vision of successful parenting. And with increased awareness and intention, you can be purposeful about leaving a healthy footprint on your children. Today's show is called Proactive Parenting with our guest, Dr. Heather Maguire. Dr. Heather has spent over a decade studying behavior and working with children, parents, and educators. She's a board-certified behavior analyst, doctoral level, and a credentialed school psychologist. In addition, she's a professor and the lead of the Applied Behavioral Analysis program at her university. And last and most importantly, she has two amazing kids. Dr. Heather, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today, Dan.
So tell us how you got into this world of behavior analysis and, of course, at some point, parenting. Tell us how your worlds have collided.
Yeah, so I was in the middle of my doctorate program, and actually I have two kids, like you said, and I was pregnant with my son in my doctorate program, and I was already a school psychologist. And one of the biggest issues I saw in the schools and whatnot was behavior issues. And even as a school psychologist, I didn't feel necessarily that the training that they were giving us in grad school was sufficient. Mm-hmm. And actually, if you talk to a lot of school psychologists, they will tell you they feel a lot of times, kind of underprepared to deal with behavior issues. So I started to look into, working with behavior specifically. I was a little crazy, so I started taking classes in addition to my doctorate program, and then eventually became a certified behavior analyst. So basically what that means is that, I started to work with families in the home setting, as well as, continuing to work in the school setting. And, I worked with a diverse population of kids, but probably the most prominent population of kids that you work with as a behavior analyst are those diagnosed with autism. Mm-hmm. And so, we helped their families and we helped the kids with autism, just kind of work through some of those really challenging behaviors, whether it was tantrums or aggressive behavior, things like that. And then when I was doing that as well, I would talk to, eventually I had my son, and, I talked to other parents, and they were like, oh, everything that you're doing with kids with disabilities, what about the situation, this situation with my kid? Right. And so I started to notice that, while, for families who had kids with disabilities, they might have access to a behavior analyst like myself, kind of for the average, everyday parenting situation, there just wasn't a lot of really good evidence-based information. There's a lot of opinions, but not necessarily, information that was based upon behavioral science. So that's kind of where I had the idea to start, working with parents, let's say, of kids. Maybe they didn't have a diagnosis of a disability, but just like, everyday parenting issues. So that's kind of how I got, to where I am today.
With lots of education and lots of experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what I love about what you're saying is because of our listeners, of course, we have plenty of people with neurodiverse kids.
Yes.
And also people that have neurotypical, or what we're calling neurotypical kids. There's always new language out there.
Yes.
And we know that all growing humans have different developmental challenges and milestones, and we parents have to try to deal with them the best way we can, regardless of our child's profile.
Yes, and I 100% agree with that.
So to set everyone up here, so on Heather's website, there's a few things that I just want to read to you because it's going to give you hope. It says, imagine a world where tantrums become less frequent and intense. Your kids get ready for the day without needing constant reminders. Bedtime is calm and pleasant, and you have a new sense of confidence and a better understanding of behavior. Like, who doesn't want that?
Hopefully everybody definitely wants that, right? Yeah. So I guess the idea is to give parents hope, right? Because I think, and I think that the topic of proactive parenting today, will hopefully result in a lot of your listeners having hope. But those are just some of the common things that, parents are struggling with in terms of the day to day. And it's those things that cause a lot of frustration. So, there's actually a lot of things, and I don't want to say that they're easy per se, but they're not rocket science, if you will. There are things that are more simple changes that you can make that will, create a meaningful difference.
So why don't we give us the 20,000 foot view conceptually, and then we're going to drill down into these different strategies that you have found to be successful in parenting kids. What would you say how would you frame this up for our listeners?
Yeah. So here's the deal. I think that it's very easy to fall into what I would call a reactive state of parenting, because you end up being in survival mode, if you will, right? Where, you're trying to get all the things done and your kids are acting out, and you just kind of fall into this routine of disciplining. And it's not that, I don't want to make anybody feel guilty, because, even I always admit, like me as a parent, even though I have, the training and the information, it's easy for me to still fall into that as well. But what I'm hoping with, trying to help parents have this, proactive parenting approach is that there's lots of things we can do to prevent your, kids from having problematic behavior. So if we kind of shift our focus to trying to put, let's say, 80% of our energy and effort into kind of this proactive or preventative mode, then hopefully we'll only have to spend, let's say, 20% of our energy on more the reactive, disciplining, things like that.
Just 20%.
That's the hope. We're all striving,
okay.
And I say this, definitely, as a parent. So I have 2 kids. So Addie is 6 and Landon just turned 9. And, every day is a different day. And actually, so my son Landon has a diagnosis of ADHD, and he is an amazing and bright and, kid. But obviously, no matter what you do, you're still going to have those hard days, those struggles. So it's not to minimize that. But again, kind of going back to what we were talking about a second ago, it's more to give that sense of hope that change is possible, because I think as parents, we can get in kind of that defeated mindset, if you will.
And for listeners, that behavior analysts are often working with percentages and numbers and reinforcers and redirections. And so when you said 20%, it made me think, oh, okay, there's a number, which I know how you're using it. But in your approach, do you ask parents to keep track of different sort of behaviors?
So if I wear my hat as a board certified behavior analyst, you're right. Like a lot of what we do is a numbers game in that we never want to assume that some of the, let's say, intervention strategies that we're using are effective unless we have data to back it up. But, I know this from just, working with parents and whatnot. What I'm talking about, with, let's say, typically developing kids and what, kind of what I want to focus on today, I'm not asking parents to, let's say, collect data, right? And because hopefully, if those parents have kids, let's say, who are having more severe problem behavior, so if it's, aggressive behavior or, let's say even self-injurious behavior, hopefully what I want them to do is, seek out professional help. But instead, I want to give them some, more simple tools and strategies to kind of just change their approach to everyday parenting situations so that they can have a more peaceful home, if you will. So I'm not, I kind of, try to actually take off my professor hat, right? So take off my numbers and drilling down on that, but to make it as accessible as possible for parents who are already busy and overwhelmed and whatnot.
Awesome. And that's the key, right? To make all of this accessible so everyone knows that this stuff, you can do it and it works.
Yeah.
So, okay. So where do we start?
Yeah. So basically what I want to talk about today, hopefully, is, what are 4 things that you can do as a parent to, change from that more reactive mode of parenting to that proactive mode of parenting. And the first thing I want to talk about, again, maybe sounds a little bit simple, but it's catching your kids being good as much as possible and praising them for it. So, kind of back to what you were saying a second ago, behavior analysts, what do we talk about a lot? We talk about reinforcement. So that is that idea of positive reinforcement, but more at like a simple level. So I think about my son. So my son, who's 9, we have daily chores that he does, and nothing crazy. He feeds the dogs and cleans his room, right? Like simple and appropriate for a 9-year-old. But he definitely struggles, especially with feeding the dogs. Like he doesn't like to feed our dogs, right? And if you think about it, so the times that he feeds the dogs, he feeds them in the morning and at night. And the morning is crazy, especially during the school week. What are we doing? We're trying to get the kids out the door, make sure that they're dressed and, they've eaten, things like that. So it's a crazy time. And then kind of flip to the end of the day, the time where he's feeding the dogs is another crazy time. I don't know about you, but I call it the witching hour.
Yes, that's exactly what it's called.
Yes. So everybody's blood sugar is low, everybody's tired and whatnot. And so I a lot of times as a mom, like I am really busy during those times. And so, and he, sometimes it's much easier to notice when he's, let's say, complaining or arguing about his chore of feeding the dogs. And if that happens, I'm going to redirect him and say, oh no, that this is your job, your responsibility, that sort of thing. But sometimes what happens is he feeds the dogs without complaining. And unfortunately, I don't always notice because I'm so busy. So just as like the reminder that, kids, this is true that sometimes any attention is better than no attention. And our kids, especially during those hard times of the day, they're craving our attention. So if he is more likely to get attention when he complains, even if it's more like let's say even a reprimand, right, on my end, like, nope, you need to feed the dogs, he, will be, if I want him to, do those things without complaining or arguing, I need to make that cognizant effort to catch him when he is listening and to give him a lot of, praise for that and encouragement for that.
And how does he respond?
Kids, and a lot of time parents might say, oh, that's overly simplistic. But the reality is, for the most part, like the kids want our approval. They want our praise. And so, and the end result isn't just how he feels in that moment. There's science and evidence to support that when we do those things, what the most likely response is that in the future, he'll be more likely to do it without complaining or arguing.
Mm-hmm. And note to listeners, this also works with spouses and partners.
My husband always accuses me of using, behavioral tactics on him. And also he's done a bunch of editing for me throughout the year. So sometimes he actually tries to use the tactics on me without me knowing, which is really funny.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
We all want to be praised for what we're doing right. And it does make us want to do it again.
Yeah. So one of the, so I teach grad school and I teach behavior analysis classes to grad students. And in one of the intro classes that I teach, we talk about, and I can't remember the exact, the authors or the year of the study, but we talk about one study where, and I think that may have been in the 60s, where there was, teachers in a classroom that were struggling with, I think they were like maybe first grade students, and the kids weren't on task. And so what the researchers noticed is that, again, like the teachers were, just kind of constantly redirecting when the kids were kind of off task. And so the only strategy that they recommended that the teachers use was this, basically, paying less attention or making less of a notice for, off task behavior, but finding the kids in the classroom who were on task and giving them a lot of praise. And just by that one thing, there was drastic change in the classrooms, and the kids as a whole, all the kids started to have, higher rates of, on task behavior. So it works in the classroom, definitely, but it also works in the home setting.
That's a powerful study.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
Okay. So number one, we are going to catch our kids being good and praising them for it.
Yes.
And then where do we move on from there?
Yeah. So another thing I want to talk about is this. It's the importance of teaching our kids respectful negotiation skills.
Yes.
Yes. So as parents, we have to sometimes remind ourselves that we're not looking for blind obedience, if you will. Like maybe blind obedience in the moment is easier to deal with because we have all the things that are on our schedule, things that we need to do, right? But the reality is that in the long term, we want our kids to be leaders. We want them to be thinkers. We don't want them to get into their teenage or, adult years and just kind of go with the flow. We want them to have a voice and to be heard. And so kind of just as an example, what I'm hoping, and it's not that I want my kids to just argue and, to go back with everything I say. It's not that, but it's, teaching the importance of teaching our kids how to respond. Like, so for example, if my son's reading a book right before bed, right? And I say, okay, Landon, it's time to go to bed. And, so blind obedience would be like, okay, but like, what if he's on the last 3 paragraphs of the book he's been reading, right? So stopping in that moment would be really frustrating. Mm-hmm. So it's giving him that voice and kind of, and this is where it becomes proactive because I can't teach it to him right in that moment. I need to find a different day and time, beforehand so that he has the words to say. But it's teaching him to say something like this. Hey, Mom, I'm on the last page of my book. Is it okay if, and then, giving me what his request is. And then my job as the parent is, if at all possible, to, give him that opportunity. But then his job as the child is like, if I say, because sometimes I'm still going to have to say no. Like, let's say it's 15 or 20 minutes past his bedtime and I know he needs to get up early and do whatnot. Or, what if I have something I need to do right away, whatever. So sometimes he's just going to have to comply. But a lot of times we can be flexible. And so it's like teaching kids the right words to say so that they are, still, being, respectful, but that they don't just have to, listen without, having a voice to whatever we say to them, if that makes sense.
Very much. And it reminds me of also an approach that I've used for years with my clients and also with my own kids, which is that Ross Greene's collaborative problem solving approach, where we're really teaching our kids to engage, and we actually really want to listen to come up with some solution that they're invested in, that they have buy-in with.
Yes. So buy-in is so important. And I talk about that a lot. Later on, we'll talk about, how you might use a reward system. And like buy-in is so important because there's a lot of things that, potentially can work in terms of, helping our kids improve their behavior. But as parents, sometimes accidentally we sabotage those things, and then we lose our kids' buy-in. And then once your kids' buy-in is lost, it's not that there's no hope. It's just that, there's a lot of work that we end up having to do on our end to kind of regain that buy-in, if you will.
Absolutely. Okay, so now we've taught them how to negotiate respectively, which is also giving them skills for life.
Yes.
And what's next?
So I think it's important to be innovative and to be, willing to change the environment, because like what works today won't necessarily work tomorrow. So if you just kind of a few examples, like, and actually, I think recently you did a podcast episode on screen time, right? And so screen time is one of these things that as parents, in today's age, we think about a lot, And so I think back to screen time. So there have been situations where in the past, I have not allowed my kids to have screen time during the week. And that's worked, really well for one reason or another. And then I, so that actually I think back to about a year ago, we're in that place where I'm like, okay, screen time, isn't working. I've noticed that my kids are having a hard time transitioning off of screen time and whatnot. But then, things change, right? And so then the next, stage, right, a few things changed. And one of the things I noticed is that, screen time became highly motivating, right? So if there's a list of things that my kids need to do after school, like let's say homework and chores and things like that, I started to realize that for them in that moment, screen time could be very motivating. And, and I was like, okay, well, maybe I'm going to try, allowing my kids to have screen time, a little bit during the week again. So we did that for a period of time and it worked pretty well. But then most recently this past week, I started to notice some of those same things where I think one of the things that had changed was this. My kids, my son, who's in 3rd grade, he was having more homework than he used to have. Right. And so all of a sudden it became highly stressful to him because he was trying to figure out time management and he was being very diligent in all the things he had to do. But really, he didn't have enough time to do everything he needed to do. Right. And have screen time. And so all of a sudden it became this anxiety provoking thing. And so I kind of once again had to readjust. And I was like, okay, I think we're going to shift back to no screen time during the week. And I, not framing it as a discipline, kind of just talking to him about how, we have lots of things going on during the week, during the weekend, he has like a screen time allotment and where he, can decide how and when he uses it. I said, but I think, during the week, we're going to go back to no screen time, which of course he wasn't thrilled about. But I can tell you over the last few days, I've noticed that anxiety drop. Whereas so for example, one of his homework assignments every day is reading. And because screen time wasn't on, wasn't an option, all of a sudden he didn't have to hurry through his reading. He's like, hey, Mom, I think I want to finish this book today. I'm going to read more than the 20 minutes that my teacher, is making me read or whatever. So again, kind of going back, what works today won't necessarily work tomorrow. And if you find yourself in a situation where something isn't working, actually thinking and trying to be innovative of strategies that could work rather than, because a lot of times, I don't know about you and your parenting, but for me, it can just be easy to kind of get stuck in that rut. And then you get into these like repeated situations where you're frustrated, your kids are frustrated, but you're not changing anything.
For sure. And the word that keeps coming to me, the concept, is flexibility. So what I like about this approach is you're being flexible and you're modeling flexibility and you're explaining why you're changing, as opposed to a lot of our kids, want us to be like, this is the rule and this is the rule always. And we, I think as parents sometimes think about that as well. Never screens this time, but no, there's exceptions. And healthy people are able to be flexible and adapt given the situation.
Yeah, for sure. And it kind of just depends on where you're at. So another thing I talk about is this, like, okay, so let's say some of your listeners out there, let's say they, some of the moms are pregnant and they are dealing with like not feeling well and nausea and things like that. In that moment, so they might have something in their mind of like, oh, I don't want my kids to be on screens too much, which is important, right? But kind of going back to that flexibility, it for a season, for a period of time, they might choose to maybe allow more screens than they, might normally, to kind of, go with what works in that moment without necessarily, getting into that trap of feeling that mom or, dad guilt that we can all get trapped in to feeling.
I'm excited to tell you all about a company that is fully aligned with our mission at Parent Footprint to create a loving and healthy world, one child and parent at a time. This company is called Wild Foods. Wild Foods is a food company that puts quality, sustainability, and health first in all of their products. They have everything from coffee to fish oil, and every single product is painstakingly sourced from small farms all around the world. And they take their mission as seriously as we do. Their mission is to fix the broken food system. And they believe that real food is medicine. They have partnered with us to give all of our listeners 12% off your order if you use the code Footprint12. You've got to check these guys out. They're at wildfoods.co. Okay, so we are catching them being good and praising. We are teaching them respectful negotiation. We are being innovative and flexible and changing the environment based on the circumstances.
Yeah.
And now are we working our way up to a reinforcement plan of sorts?
Yeah. And really quick too, I was just thinking one last thing about thing about changing the environment. A lot of times we have the tools to make the change, but it's just hard to do it. So I think about, there was a situation this past summer. So I signed my kids up. So I'm a professor. I do a few different things, but during the summers, I have more flexible hours. And I was kind of working on a side project this summer. And so anyways, my husband and I had decided that our kids were going to go to this really cool camp, right? It's one of those camps where, they get to swim, they get to do it was a lot of fun. But what I didn't look at before I signed them up for this camp and committed a bunch of their summer to that was traffic and how far away it was.
Yeah.
And so, I swear, as parents, we don't realize that we're going to end up, one of our primary duties is going to be that of the chauffeur. But I found myself in that chauffeur for the summer for a bit, driving back and forth. And in fact, trying to be like cognizant of saving gas money. We were taking our small car versus the SUV. And so my kids had to sit like really close to each other and they were bored in the car. So I found that every day for the first few weeks of camp, we were getting into this pattern where they would, we'd start the trip and then they would start, edging too close together. And then I'm like, okay, there's a line. So you see the line, you sit on this side.
I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you.
You sit on that side. So then my son would start kind of like edging his fingers over and Hattie's like, he's on my side. And, so basically, and this is kind of embarrassing to admit as a behavior analyst and Yeah, I'm human. And so all of a sudden, like, this is how it would basically start to end. I would finally be like, you know what? You guys need to stop fighting, and nobody is talking for the rest of the trip. No talking.
Yes.
So, and this happened for a little bit. And then one day, my kids got out of the car, and I kind of just looked at myself, and I was defeated and frustrated. And I just kind of looked at myself in the mirror, and I was like, what are you doing? Like, if you were talking to a parent with this situation, what would you tell them?
Yes.
And it highlights the importance of kind of mindset where you might know how to change the environment, but again, you're human, and so you might not, even though you know how. It's really not until you make that decision to make the change that you will actually make it. So I went home. I came up with like a list of things that they could do in the car. So I kind of diagnosed the issue. It was attention-seeking behavior, and why? Because they were bored. So I came up, with a list of things that they could do in the car, things that they, didn't have available to them outside of the car time, right? So I increased the value of the activity by saying like, okay, you can only do it in the car. And so just by coming up with a few little things they could do in the car, they were distracted and they didn't fight with each other. And so but it wasn't until, I guess the main point of that, it wasn't until I kind of made that decision to change my mindset and to shift to this, proactive approach that it changed. So anyways, we know how to change the environment a lot of times. We just, life happens and we don't do it.
Exactly. And thank you for that story, because everyone needs to hear that even though we do this stuff for a living, we fall into all of the same traps, desperation, as they do. And my kids certainly have done the same thing. And I was just having a flashback of when my brother and I were your kids' ages. And I think we were driving back from a trip from San Diego, if I recall. I remember my parents saying, "We are never taking you on a trip again." I remember thinking that sounds really final, but we went on other trips. But we've all been there.
Yeah, sometimes we make, as parents, we can all be guilty of making threats that we don't intend keeping. I actually, when you said that, it reminded me last year. My kids, it was a few days before my son's birthday party, and my kids, they have separate rooms now, but they shared a room up until recently, and they were supposed to go to bed, and they were arguing and not going to bed and whatnot. And so finally, I went into their bedroom, and it was really my son who was bothering my daughter. I could tell. So I was like, Landon, if I have to come in here again, I'm canceling your birthday party. And then I was like, I can't believe I just said that. I'm not going to rewind.
Yeah.
I can't believe I said that, because obviously I'm not going to cancel his birthday party. So don't make threats that you're not going to keep. But also, like, why would I say that? So, and actually, that kind of highlights. So if any of your listeners, are resonating with that, one of the things that I would suggest in situations like that, and it can be hard, but apologize to your kids. Get into the habit. As parents, a lot of times we can feel like, we don't want to admit that we're human, if you will. And so I think modeling that, conflict resolution and apology, like, I'm sorry I said that, I didn't mean it, or I'm sorry I yelled at you, I shouldn't yell at you, can really be helpful. But looking back, it's okay to kind of laugh at ourselves too, and realize that what were we thinking?
Yeah, we have to laugh at ourselves.
Yes.
Okay, reinforcement.
Yeah. So, by the way, I have a resource for your listeners. So we'll talk in a moment. I'll start talking about reinforcement systems, reward systems, motivation systems. But if they go to my website, Prism Behavior, PRISM Behavior.com /free guide, what they can do is actually download a guide of how to use reward systems with kids of different ages, because you use it
nice.
somewhat differently with kids of different ages. But really kind of the key to, proactive parenting, where you're spending most of your effort on, preventing, behavior issues rather than reacting to them, is a reward system. And so, again, there's lots of different types, but let me tell you a little bit about the type of reward system that I use with my own kids. And so basically with my own kids, I use a quarter system where they have, it sounds official, but really they have a piggy bank each, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And what I do is I have a list of behaviors that they do to earn quarters. Okay. And so, and it changes from time to time. But like when I first started using the system with them, the two main issues that I was seeing in terms of their behavior was doing homework, right? Because they didn't want to do their homework. And I mean, I could get on a pedestal and talk about how I don't agree with homework, but that's a different conversation for a different day. For now, they do homework, and they, that's the expectation. So, so they were, so doing homework. And by the way, I would give them a certain amount of quarters for completing their homework, but then I would give them like, homework or quarters in addition to that if they did their homework without complaining or arguing, because I wanted to, no matter what, as long as they did it, it was like they got the reward, but then they got an even better reward if they did it without complaining or arguing, if that makes sense.
Yes, having a good attitude.
Yeah. So, because I had found that, homework, again, it was one of those situations where we were just going to battle every day, and it was hard on them and hard on me. And so that was one behavior we chose to focus on. And then another behavior we chose to focus on was getting ready on time in the morning. And so if they, so they had their checklist of what they needed to do. And so as long as they got ready on time, then they would get quarters. So those were kind of the two things we were, when I initially was using the system with my kids, what I was rewarding them for. And so here was like the basic idea. And again, this type of reward system is probably more appropriate for kids who are in elementary school, who kind of have a concept of, a little bit more of delayed gratification, right? Because we could talk about how, for younger kids, definitely you need rewards that happen more right away. But then for my kids, what we would do then, initially at the end of the week, but then, later on at the end of the month, what they would do is be able to basically divide their quarters into different piles, right? So one pile would go towards like spending money, one would go towards their savings account, and then one would go towards giving away to charity to our church. Nice. And the idea here too was like, okay, I want to reward appropriate behavior, but I also want to take any opportunity I can to teach kind of like, financial responsibility to kids at a young age.
That is wonderful, because it's, and I wanted to ask you about the critics. There's, critics of this approach that I want to ask you a question about. And I love that not only are you reinforcing a positive behavior, but then also it's not just about money and getting stuff, right? You're teaching about saving. You're teaching about, yes, that you can get stuff for yourself. And this is how we also give and help others.
Yeah. So bring on the critics. Yes.
Yeah, the critic question, because I get this all the time too over the years, which is, but if you reinforce them for doing things that they're supposed to do anyways, then aren't they just going to grow up wanting to be paid and reinforced for everything they do?
Right. And so, well, first of all, I think that that's a valid point. By the way, there is research to suggest that if we provide kind of like arbitrary reinforcement or rewards for things that kids already do, that is not helpful. So, if your child's not struggling with something, so for example, if they're already doing their homework without complaining, it would be not advisable to, incorporate that into their reward system, because then what you might see is actually a reliance on, where they used to do their homework for, nothing, if you will, or for just because that's what they're supposed to do. And then you were to start to pay them for it, let's say, and then you tried to take that reward away, that would be problematic. So there is research to suggest that. So choosing behaviors that your child is actually struggling with is really important.
Yes.
But here's the reality. We in life everything that we do has some sort of reinforcement. So to kind of get a little bit, nerdy, if you will, like, as a behavior analyst, I break behavior down into, the antecedent behavior consequence, or, the setting before the behavior happens, like what that looks like, right? The behavior itself, and then what happens after the behavior. So as people, we only do things that, result in some type of reward where we, want something positive happens, and then, then we're more likely to do them again. So that's just kind of how we operate as people. If you break behavior down to its, very simplistic, to a very simplistic understanding. So whether you know that it's there or not, we're getting provided that reinforcement. And for sure, if, for kids, let's say, who, if your kids, like I said before, are not struggling with homework, then, probably just the fact that you're giving them that praise and whatnot is enough. But for things that they actually are struggling with, so here you have to kind of weigh these two things. So you can either continue to, have this dynamic of struggle and frustration and lack of progress, right?
Yep.
Or you can use a motivation system like that and then, see the types of outcomes that you want, where rather than your child arguing and complaining, that they are starting to do their homework. And then you won't have to necessarily, reward them for that forever. So I think about my own son now, like he and my daughter as well, they do their homework now without complaining or arguing. We've been able to move on. The chores are still a little bit of a struggle, but we've been able to move on because, he, I think about my son specifically because he was the one who was struggling more with it. He was able to come in and realize that, he got the quarters and the praise for the homework, but also then he was able to see that he got, praise from his teacher, and he was able to see that he was doing well in school. So then kind of those natural consequences and that natural rewards, were able to kick in for him. So just because you provide more arbitrary reinforcement initially, there's not evidence to suggest that, you can't fade that back and that it's harmful.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Right. It makes perfect sense. And the other thing that is totally aligned that I tell parents all the time is most of us do an incentive system to help our kids learn to use the potty.
Yeah.
And once they do, none of us have to give them stickers to use the potty. Because,
no, forever, no.
You internalize this sense of competence, and then in most cases, you like this skill that you have gained, and then you're willing to do it for intrinsic reasons instead of extrinsic or external reasons.
Yeah. So basically what you're doing when you use a reward system is you're accelerating the learning process, right? And
like
so,
yes.
Yeah. So, and again, it's not that your kids would never learn how to do their homework without complaining, okay? But they might learn how to do it a lot faster, but also your home might be a more, peaceful place if you use a reward system, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. And that's what we all want, is a more peaceful home where the relationship does not get eaten up by all of the conflict and the day-to-day weeds of all the stuff that we're dealing with our kids.
Yeah.
Okay. So Heather, you have enlightened us with, I'm going to repeat these 4 things for people to think about, and then we're moving to the parent footprint moment question.
Perfect.
Okay. So catch kids being good and praise them. Teach them about respectful negotiation. Be innovative and willing to change the environment. And then set up strategic, well thought out reward systems based on things that they have not yet learned and are causing a lot of conflict that you want to accelerate the learning process.
Yes.
All right. Okay. So, parent footprint moment question. Tell us about a time when you became aware of yourself as a parent or as an individual, and that new awareness had a positive impact on your child.
Yeah. So I think back to probably, it's really one of the defining moments in my life as an adult, but it definitely had a significant impact in my parenting. I think it's been about 5 years. I was coming out of one of the hardest years of my life. Okay. So, unfortunately, I had a health situation, where I had 6 surgeries in 9 months.
Wow.
And it was pretty crazy. And at that time, by the way, I had already had both of my kids, and my son, I think, was 3, and my daughter was about 1. And also, like right before I started, a few months before I had my first surgery, I had started a new job, and it was supposed to be this like the end all be all job. But it ended up, even though, there was a lot of positive things about that job, it was very stressful. I think under other circumstances, it would have been different, but being a young mom and having the health situation and then having that job, it just became really hard. And then in the midst of all that, we had a babysitter who had been watching our kids for a few years. We trusted her with everything, and she ended up stealing from us.
Oh, God.
And it was heartbreaking. And so we had to, unfortunately, we had to let her go. And so we were we had been trying kind of unsuccessfully to find a good replacement for her. And there was just this moment. So I came home from work, and my son was on the floor playing with the newest sitter, who, by the way, had just put in her notice that she was going to go off and do something else. Unfortunately, it seemed like she kind of actually used us just as a stepping stone, and then she had other plans. So she never had even planned to stay with us long term. And so anyways, I came home, and my son's playing with her, and he can't remember her name. And so first he calls her the name of the one babysitter who had stolen from us, and that had been heartbreaking. That was still raw. Then he called her the next babysitter's name. So he cycles through these names and can't remember her name. And I don't know what it was about that moment, but I just kind of had a reckoning with myself, and I was like, you know what? I didn't really ever see my life, happening this way, but with all the stress and all that, I decided in that moment, I was like, I think I'm going to quit my job. I don't have any plans that, and by the way, I was a part-time adjunct instructor as well. And I could do some contract assessments and whatever, but the big job that, whatever, I was like, I think I need some time to heal. Not only, and at that moment I was done with all, no other surgeries were on the horizon, but it just, I needed to recover still, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, all those things. And so I made kind of a radical decision. My friends and family were shocked. I've always been very type A, go-getter, whatnot. And, and then, by the way, eventually a year later, I accepted the position at the university where I work today. And so, but really for that short period of time, I just needed that time to, kind of reestablish my relationship with my kids and to do all those things and work on myself, so that I was kind of ready for that next phase of my life, if you will.
That was a big sort of this earthquake awareness, right? I mean, you had so many
it was the culmination of so many things. But I'll just be 100% honest, as hard as that situation was. And by the way, I'm very, I'm healthy today, no issues.
Wonderful.
But but as hard as that was, I honestly think that it ended up being not that I would want to go through that situation again, but I can see the positive in it. And I am at a totally different place today, so that I would be well, going through that hard situation was almost, I would say, worth it, in terms of, where I am today is a completely different place. And I would be a completely different person and a mom if I hadn't gone through that hard situation.
Yes. And I am sure your son loved having you there.
Yes.
Yes.
Actually, I was just talking to my kids last night. So I'm a professor, but I teach grad school at night. And then also I teach some online classes, and I do, I have my Prism Parenting podcast and a few things going on, but I have flexibility in my schedule. So I get to see my kids a lot. And I was talking to my son last night, and I was like, do you even remember, do you remember when I had a job where I left the house every single day and you had a babysitter and all that? And he was like, I don't remember that, Mom, so it's kind of funny to think it doesn't seem like that long ago, but for him, it's a lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing. And I'm glad that you are healthy.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So you led us right to the next phase of winding down here, which is tell everyone again about your website, about your podcast, where they can find all of the work that you're doing.
Yeah. So my website is prismbehavior.com. You'll find different resources there. And actually, it's kind of exciting. I'll be launching a parenting course this year. So more on that later.
Nice.
But I have the Prism Parenting podcast, and you can find that anywhere you find your podcasts, right? And that guide is at prismbehavior.com/free guide. And I'll walk you through how to use different rewards and motivation systems with kids of different ages. And then I'm on Instagram at Prism Behavior.
Heather, thanks so much for your wisdom and sharing and open and honesty today with all of us. So it just helps every time we hear an expert talk about their own real journey within the professional area of expertise, because we're all in this together doing the best we can. And we have to be kind to ourselves and keep learning as we go.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening, everyone. You know what to do. Check us out at www.parentfootprint.com. Subscribe to this podcast. Share it with others who want to live full lives themselves and raise happy, healthy, and engaged kids. Be the person you want your child to become. And as always, ask yourself the guiding question: what footprint do you want to leave?